This podcast is sponsored by Bigger Brains, online training that won't bore you to tears. Expand the minds of your workforce at getbiggerbrains.com.
Welcome to Permission to Speak, the video blog and podcast that loiters at the intersection of leaders who want their people to speak up, technology that facilitates connections, and results that serve our higher purpose. Now, here's your host, Kelly Vandever.
Hi, welcome to the podcast. This is Kelly Vandever, and my special guest today is Dr. Elizabeth Morrison. Dr. Morrison is a professor in the Management and Organization Department, the ITT Harold Janine Professor in Creative Management, and the Vice Dean of Faculty at the Stern School at New York University. Professor Morrison's research focuses on different ways employees behave proactively at work, the conditions that enable such behavior, and how proactive behavior facilitate both career success and improve organizational effectiveness. Her research focuses on employee voice and silence, the reasons employees are reluctant to speak up, and how organizations can create climates more open to employee input. She has won several awards for her research, including the Cummings Scholar Award from the Organizational Behavior Division of the Academy of Management. Professor Morrison's work has been I should be saying Dr. Morrison's work has been has been published in the Academy of Management Journal, Academy of Management Review, Journal of Applied Psychology, Journal of Organizational Behavior, and Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes. She has served on the Executive Committee of the Organizational Behavior Division of the Academy of Management and as Associate Editor for Academy of Management Journal. She teaches courses in leadership, collaboration and negotiation, and organizational behavior. Welcome, Dr. Morrison, to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Now, as you know, we start out by asking a couple of quirky questions to get to know our interviewees a little better. So my first quirky question for you is, what is your favorite guilty pleasure television show?
Oh my goodness. So I have to say I do watch a lot of junk on TV. It's sort of my way of relaxing in the evening after a day of, thinking a little too hard about things. One show I have to say I think it's a particular guilty pleasure is Shark Tank. So as you just mentioned, I teach negotiation, and to me that is just such an interesting example of, you see the negotiation, you see the different ways in which people are trying to sell their ideas and convince the investors, and it's also just fun to see what their ideas are. I mean, some of them are like brilliant and others are just totally stupid.
Well, and I always love the ones that are like, why didn't I think of that?
Yeah, exactly. And then the ones like, who would buy that?
I know, right? Very, very cool. All righty. And so for our second quirky question is, tell us something surprising about yourself that most people don't know.
Well, so one thing that most people don't know, and something that I know when I tell people, they're often really surprised. And I think actually that reaction says something about our society and about some of the assumptions that we make. But for several years, all through college, my summer job, I worked in a factory. And people are often really surprised that, to hear that I worked in a factory. And somehow that doesn't kind of fit their image of, a summer job for somebody,
Right. Yeah, in academia, right? A doctor.
Yeah, but I have to say, I mean, it was an awful job. It was an awful place to work. But it was so valuable for me to just see what that type of work is like and what the day-to-day is like for people who do this for their whole work careers.
Well, and now I'm curious, is that what led you into this field to begin with?
I believe that everything in our lives in some ways shapes the path we end up on. I mean, not in an explicit way. What was more explicit for me, what was more kind of obvious, was when I graduated college, and I graduated with a degree in psychology. I studied liberal arts. I had no idea of what I really wanted to do. And somehow I ended up in retail management. And I thought this would be fun to work in a department store, and it seemed glamorous. And I had no business experience at all. No courses in business, no, work experience. And And here I was now a manager of a fairly large department in this department store chain. And that was really kind of my first eye-opening glimpse of what organizational life is like. And I decided very early on, like, I don't want to do this, but I want to help organizations, companies do this better in terms of how they manage people to make workplaces better for people. And that was when I didn't even know there was an area called organizational behavior, but I kind of knew what it was I wanted to study, and I found it, and that's what led me on the path that I've been on ever since.
Well, so interesting, so interesting. And I forgot to ask, well, what kind of factory was it? What kind of things did you manufacture?
It was, we made junk mail. It was a printing factory that basically made the stuff that you get and you toss out.
That is so funny. That is so funny.
It wasn't even, we weren't even making a useful product for most years.
Well, it's useful to somebody, and somebody was buying something that they kept doing it, right?
Exactly.
Well, so interesting. Very different kind of organizations than that you worked in. So I guess that leads to our next question that maybe we've already opened the door a little bit. But I'm really curious about this area of employee voice and employee silence. So what is your story? What happened in your life that got you into this place where you cared about employees having a voice at work?
Sure. So I have always been interested in how people experience work. So if I had to characterize the work that I've done, for almost 30 years now, it's been really focused on how people experience work, how they navigate their careers, and how they make a difference at work. And I've studied that in different ways. Fairly early in my academic career, so when I was still a fairly more junior professor, I experienced a set of things, and it was an environment at that time where I just began to observe some things with respect to reluctance to speak up. And it really fascinated me because, here are what I was witnessing were people who were super smart, assertive, successful. Many of them had tenure, so they couldn't even be fired. And yet I would see these meetings where it was clear from the hallway conversations that people didn't agree with a particular decision or had some concerns, and yet they weren't voicing them, they weren't raising them. And that just really struck me. What is it about? Is it just this environment? Is there something about this leadership that is making people feel that they need to hold back with their concerns? And as I began to explore it, I just became struck that this seems to be a really widespread phenomenon. I mean, anyone I have talked to can think of situations at work where they've had a different opinion or had a concern and just haven't, or at least have hesitated in terms of whether they should raise it or not.
Absolutely, absolutely. And reading some of your research, I was struck by, yep, I've been there and I've seen this, and it's just kind of a universal phenomenon that way.
Right. I mean, we've all been there. And so that says there's probably something about human nature, just us as human beings. And I've been really interested in that as somebody trained in psychology. What is it about how we're wired that makes us be uncomfortable, creating disharmony, challenging authority? I think there's a number of things that are going on there. But then I also believe, as an organizational scholar, that there's something about organizational structures that make this even more intense. And it's a problem because we need ideas from employees to innovate, to come up with new ideas, to detect problems. And so if this is really a very strong tendency to not express things, then that has implications for organizations' performance.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if you wouldn't mind, explain employee voice and employee science, and you've already kind of touched on why that's important, but just to give folks an understanding of where your research, some of your research.
Sure. So I think that's actually a good question to ask, just to start with, because the terms voice and silence are used in lots of different ways. I mean, just in kind of, just in our normal, in a variety of different ways. And even people who study voice and silence often think about them differently. So, but what I mean by voice, and other people, organizational behavior researchers who study voice, generally refers to whenever employees share an idea, a concern, a suggestion, or an opinion about a workplace issue. Silence is when employees have ideas, concerns, different opinions, and consciously withhold that information. So it's not just not speaking. I mean, there's times that we don't speak because we don't have anything to say.
Right.
But when we do have something to say and we keep it to ourselves rather than express it, and it's something potentially of relevance to the workplace, then that would be what I define as silence.
Okay, so you mentioned, I love the term that you use in some of your research, the utility calculus that employees do when they decide whether or not to speak up.
Yeah.
So would you mind talking about that? And
Sure. So that's just a really very fancy academic way of saying that we consider costs and benefits, right? We do that in every choice that we make, every minute of the day. We're making sure we're constantly going through this thing of like, okay, pluses, minuses, and which way is the scale tipped. In terms of the benefits, part of what goes into that consideration is, oh, I have this good idea. Maybe I can help my work group do things better. Or, gee, there's this problem. Maybe I need to, if I raise it, it'll get fixed. On the other hand, we as human beings, we have kind of limited time and energy. And so we're thinking, oh, is it worthwhile? If I raise it, is anything going to happen? And if not, like, why bother, right? You don't do things if it's not going to accomplish anything. You've got other things to do. You consider the cost. Oh, if I speak up, maybe I'll get, oh, great idea. That's wonderful. And you'll get all these positive, accolades. Conversely, you could say something and people think it's a really stupid idea, or it makes you look kind of ignorant, or people think you're just complaining. And so there's this consideration of what does it mean for how people see me and my future, my relationships with my colleagues, my relationship with my supervisor. And one of the things that I've discovered in my research that's really striking is that people have a variety of pretty strong beliefs about bad things that can happen to them if they speak up. And sometimes those aren't even necessarily realistic, accurate beliefs, but those are the things that go into this calculus as people think, well, I should speak up, but on the other hand, if I do, here are all the bad things that might happen, so I won't speak up.
So where do these beliefs generally come from? What have you found?
Well, so I can't say that I've necessarily found this, but this is what, just kind of based on the research that I've done, that I really believe these beliefs come from. So one is that there's good reason to believe that as human beings, we have evolved to be vigilant in situations of to be aware of hierarchy. You see this even in other primates, right? That you recognize who's the alpha male and you don't challenge them. And so I think we're kind of wired to, and we're wired to be social beings, to not create friction within our social group, to be accepted within our social group. So I think there's just things about us as human beings that kind of give rise to these beliefs. But I think as powerfully, perhaps even more powerfully, we're socialized from a really early age. Don't talk back. Don't be a tattletale. Respect authority. We hear it from our parents and our teachers and religious leaders. And so before we even enter the workplace, we have kind of these mental schemas, these beliefs in our heads about, what, you keep quiet about certain things, and you want to be a good team player. And so I think those are the two main things. And then on top of that, we are always observing what's going on around us and updating our beliefs based on that. So if you come into a workplace and you see somebody and they raise their hand at a meeting and say something that others disagree with, and they get shot down for that, that's a powerful lesson. And the next time you're at a meeting and you're thinking about, should I raise my hand, that experience is salient to you.
Now, I also read where you said that a lot of times leaders are kind of oblivious to the fact that employees aren't speaking up. Like, they make the assumption that employees have issues with things that they will speak up.
Right.
What has led to that, and what can you tell leaders that might be listening that they need to watch out for in that regard?
So, and I say this and I believe this as somebody who has been in positions of leadership, and I'm currently in a position of leadership. Right. I'm the vice dean of faculty. We have a faculty of over 200, full-time professors here. I mean, I'm in a position where, I'm meeting with and talking with members of the faculty all the time, with students, and I'm acutely aware of, I believe I'm approachable. I have an open door policy. If somebody has an issue, of course they're going to come to me, right? I'm not going to bite anybody's head off. I mean, I think that most leaders truly believe that they want to hear what people have to say, even though we don't always, but we like to, tell ourselves that, oh, yes, I want to hear if you don't like this idea. We believe that we're approachable, but we don't always step back and recognize that there may be things just about the role that we're in, right? The fact that I am the dean, that can be intimidating for people. Or people just have had experience with, they may not know me that well, but they've had experience with other people in positions of authority. And so they're more hesitant to raise things. Or even if they just may think, oh, she's too busy, she doesn't want to be bothered with this issue. And so I think it's just really natural to not, we're not aware of things that we don't see. And so if we're in a room and we say, oh, does anybody have any questions or concerns? And nobody says anything, we assume everybody's in agreement. And so what I would advise leaders, and it's not easy, but it's easier to say than to do, is to just really be careful about those assumptions and try to kind of, self-correct them so that you're, just to kind of stop yourself and say, okay, wait a minute. The fact that nobody has said anything doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's in agreement. Maybe I need to, ask a more direct question. Maybe I need to have some one-on-one conversations. Realize that if people's default is to not voice, then as a leader, I need to do things to override that natural tendency. I need to, left to their own devices, people may not raise issues. So what can I do in terms of creating an environment of psychological safety where people will be more inclined to speak up?
Well, and I was very excited when I read your research, the one about looking at people that were in, how did you say it, like low power positions, and if their leader made it okay, if the leader was open, that they were just as likely as people in higher power positions to speak up. I don't know if I explained that very well, but would you mind talking through that research?
Sure. I mean, that's actually one of my favorite studies that I've done. I just find it so fascinating and so important. So kind of the big picture of what we found in that study was that most people, when they feel that they are lacking in power relative to others around them, they're more likely to remain silent than to speak up. We found that across 3 different studies. One of them was in a healthcare context. So we found that when nurses and staff in doctors' offices, even if they have concerns that may have bearing on patient care,
right,
if they're feeling particularly like, I don't have a lot of power around here, I'm insignificant, I don't have an influence, they were less likely to speak up. Then we did an experiment, and what's really nice about research that you can do in a laboratory is that you can really, you can manipulate something, you can look at the effect, and we put people in this situation where they were working with somebody who they thought, was their boss. They were told, you're the employee, this is your boss, and your boss is going to give you these instructions. And the boss kind of made a blatant mistake. I mean, it was obvious that they did something that just went against the instructions they were given. I mean, there was no ambiguity about whether, something was amiss. And we found that generally a shocking level of not saying anything, just going along. Okay, my boss said to do it, fine, I'll do it. I'm not going to say anything. But we found that effect much stronger in a condition where we got people into a low power mindset. We got them to think about themselves in situations where they've been lacking in power. So they were feeling disempowered, and they were, we found a very, very high percentage of just not speaking up. So that's the bad news. The good news is that we found, and I think this is where there's a really useful lesson, is that we found if the leader adopted and conveyed a leadership style of openness, like I really want to hear what employees have to say, that's my style as a leader, that would mitigate that effect. And so I think that's important because the reality is there are a lot of people in low power positions and low power jobs. Organizations, even even the most progressive 21st century organization, there is a hierarchy. It may be relatively flat, but there are still status differences. There's power differences. That's not going to go away. But this suggests that those aren't deterministic of whether people, feel comfortable speaking up or not. There's things that you can do to even make low power people feel capable of making a difference at work.
Yeah, and I just got very excited about it because I remember early in my career as a manager, there was an incident that came up with, this was back when I was in the Navy, and there was an incident that came up with a sailor, and it's like everybody that worked around him knew what was going on, but we were like in the dark, and I was like, why did they not tell us? If they told us, we could have gotten some help earlier on, and so just that's always been a bit fascinating to me, and the fact that even if people have that mindset, if we can as a leader change the reality there by saying that we're more open to, we want to hear the bad news, even if it's not fun to hear. We would need to hear it, and we want to hear it. And
right. And then you have to work really careful to make sure that's not just what you're saying, but that you're actually, acting on it. And I think this is where it can become really hard for leaders because, anybody who's been a manager, you're in a situation where even if you want to be the most open leader around, the end of a long day, and you just, all kinds of stuff is flying at you from the left and the right and the center, and somebody comes in and says, "Oh, we've got a problem." You have to work really hard to control your facial expression because your automatic reaction is, "I don't want to hear it." And people pick up on those cues. And so I think that's where kind of some mindfulness as a leader is important, being able to kind of, okay, take a deep breath, don't react, listen, don't instantly jump on the person, even if all of your just, primal instincts are to kind of lash out and say, stop.
Exactly. And I was lucky. I had somebody in my career that one day said to me, your mouth is saying, yes, I want to hear it, but your face is not saying that. And that was a gift. It really was. So, well, let's talk about one of the research studies that you did that I thought was also interesting was you partnered with a professor in India and did some research with some engineers there. So having worked in an IT organization for a number of years, one thing that maybe was a stereotype that went around is it was hard to get folks from India to disagree with something that was going on. So do you see cultural differences, or is there something leaders need to be aware of when it comes to, because we have so many multicultural organizations, global organizations now. Anything from that study or other research you've done that might be helpful for leaders to know?
Yeah, no, great question. And so let me just say first, and so I've done that project in India. I've done some work in China. I've taught in China, and like you, I think I've been aware of kind of some of the beliefs, the stereotypes that within certain cultures people don't challenge, they don't speak up, and on average, overall, there are these differences, but I also think we have to be really careful because one thing that we found in that study, because we had a lot of skeptics that said, oh, you're studying voice in India? You're not going to get voice in India. We found huge variance within this one Indian company. We found there were some work groups where people were speaking up a lot and others where they weren't. And so it's not as clean cut as, there's cultures where people speak up and there's cultures where people don't speak up. Where I think there's, what leaders need to recognize, though, is that there may be differences with respect to how people speak up, how directly versus indirectly, with just how comfortably they speak up. And, for most people, even if you're not working directly with people, in other parts of the world, you probably have people on your team from different cultural backgrounds. And so the more that you can understand those backgrounds that they've come from and how that might be shaping their comfort or discomfort with respect to challenging your authority, raising different ideas, speaking up in a group, and realize that what may just seem kind of natural for an American, say, may not be natural for somebody who's, from India or Taiwan or, Peru.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much for that. I just was curious about your thoughts there.
Yeah.
One of the things that I found surprising in the literature review you mentioned that extroverted leaders tend to be more defensive, I think is how you put it, than introverted leaders, which I found that fascinating. As an extroverted leader, I found that interesting.
That's not a study I can claim credit for, but
Right.
it's a fascinating study. I agree with you.
So how do you already mentioned, checking yourself, making sure you're not showing that defensive. Are there other ways that leaders can promote voice and kind of overcome some of that default that seems very prevalent?
Right. No, good question. So the study you're referring to is by one that I just, whenever you find a study that is so counterintuitive, it really kind of makes you stop and say, what's going on here? So this is a study by Adam Grant and Francesco Gino and David Hoffman, where they found that it's a little more complicated than extroverted leaders are more defensive, but that's part of the story. What they found is that when employees are proactive, when they are taking initiative, so that includes voice and includes other ways in which employees are just showing more initiative at work, that has a positive effect in a workplace where if your boss is more introverted, but it actually has a negative effect on team performance if your boss is more extroverted. So that's weird because you think that it should always be a good thing.
Right.
But what it found is that that they use this idea of complementarity, that when you have kind of a dominant person working with a more submissive person, there's kind of it's kind of clear who's in charge and who's following, and that when you have an extroverted leader who's more likely to be, okay, I'm calling the shots, I'm leading things, and you have employees who are asserting themselves more, that may create some friction, it may create some challenges to status, and so actually that undermines group performance. But the other thing that they also talked about was that there is also that also brings out it can bring out a defensiveness in extroverted leaders. And so I think, for any leader, extroverted or introverted, one of the key takeaways from that work as well as others is the importance of something that is often called psychological safety, which is, psychological safety is kind of in people's heads, but it's created from the work environment, and it reflects the extent to which people feel that it is safe for them to engage in behaviors that might be risky, and that they can, it includes the belief that speaking up is something that they can do without negative repercussions. And some of the key ways of doing that is, as I touched on, is routinely and actively encouraging and asking for input. Because if you have a leadership style where you are routinely asking for people's input, people are going to be more likely to come to you when unsolicited with information. If that's just kind of the way we do business here, this is how we interact. I want you, you're signaling that you want their input and you value it and that you use their input. And then the other, one other thing is this mindfulness that I mentioned of listening without judging, without reacting. It doesn't mean that you don't, question and maybe challenge some ideas, but the first thing that one should always try to do is to let me just hear what you're saying, and not do anything that sends off those cues that can instantly shut people down.
Good. So is it helpful if leaders tell stories about some of their own experiences, because most leaders are not just plopped into a leadership role without having some, or there's a lot of organizations that promote from within. So yes. Can leaders help by telling some of those stories? Are there other specific things that they can do?
Well, I think telling stories is one way that one can be one very useful way of creating a sense of humanizing a leader, to creating a sense of humility, a sense of authenticity, and that's something that has been shown to make it easier for people to speak up if they can see, okay, this person, they've made mistakes, they're human, and so telling stories can be a way of just leveling the playing field in a sense. And things as simple. So stories is one way. Another is, how I'll give you one, kind of pretty simple, but I think interesting example is that there's some research showing that leaders who talk in terms of we versus I, so they, talk more, that conveys a sense that we're more equal, we're a team, rather than I'm the leader, you're the follower. I mean, something as simple as just the pronouns that you're using can help to kind of minimize those perceptions of status differences.
Nice, nice. So, what about organizationally? Are there things that if organizations want to encourage voice in employees, that they can do? If we've got some executives listening that want to have more an open environment, what kinds of things can organizations do?
Well, so what I'll say is, this is not a quick fix. If you have a work environment that really has a problem with respect to something even as severe as what some of my work refer to as a climate of silence, where there's very strong beliefs that are inhibiting people from speaking up, you're not going to change that easily or overnight, because it's like with anything in an organization, organizational culture is deeply embedded. You don't just change it by saying it. You need to really build it into all of your practices and create an environment where this is just the way we do things. So, how do you create an environment where people feel that speaking up is encouraged and valued and expected? Well, you have to show that day in and day out through every little act that you take, through day-to-day practices. You need to create environments where that gets reinforced. It's much more than just saying it. But there's also some tools that can be used, and I worked with one company that was experimenting with some things that I thought were really interesting, with trying to, in kind of a fun way, of trying to create mechanisms that made it more normal for people to challenge one another and to challenge ideas. So one example was to have a safe word. So if you're in a so if you're in a meeting and it kind of says, okay, I'm gonna say something now that might be controversial, withhold judgment. It kind of warns people that that's what you're about to do. Another was a tool for just getting a quick read of the room, getting people. They called it fist to five. So they would ask everybody in the room to put up either, who's supportive. So a fist would be not at all, a one would be a little bit, a five would be, and then that would give a quick read, rather than saying, does anybody have any objections? And then you have to be the lone person to raise your hand. This was a way of getting everybody to indicate, where are you? And then based on where the group is, to then have a further discussion.
Oh, interesting. Very interesting. Now, have you studied any organizations or worked with any organizations that have like social enterprise tools, where it's something like a Yammer, where it's an internal system to the organization, and they talk about things related to projects or more personal things as well?
Yeah, so I haven't worked with any companies or I haven't looked at that study. That I've worked with companies that do use those, some of those types of platforms, and I think that it'd be interesting to study, because I think that also creates an environment of just open information exchange and open communication.
Okay, well, once you get that study done, I'd love to read it and have you back on to talk about it. Okay. Now, I did read in one of the things that you wrote. It might have been, I don't remember if it was your research or part of the literature review, but there is some evidence that the way that an employee speaks up can have an impact, a positive or negative, on their career. So if you have some people thinking about speaking up, would you give them some advice on how to go about that?
I wish we knew more about that, because to me, that's the key. It's so much more about how you speak up, when you speak up, than just do you speak up or not. And, we're just beginning to understand that. The advice that I would give to employees is really kind of three things to keep in mind. One is timing. Not all, sometimes there are times that are better than others for raising issues, both in terms of the timing of where a particular project might be in its life cycle. Raising an issue after we've kind of all made a decision versus early on in the process is going to be generally received differently. But also thinking about timing, when do you go to your boss? At the beginning of a day, at the end of the day, do you have the conversation in the quick 5 minutes in the hallway, or do you set aside a time? So I pay attention to think about timing, and trying to select a timing where whoever it is that you're having a conversation with is most likely to be open and non-defensive and have the time and space to, really process what you're saying. The other is framing. The same information, the same message can be framed in such a different way. You can raise something in a way that, can vary along a continuum from a very helpful suggestion to just whining. And it's the same information, but it's, how you frame it and how you kind of justify, why you're raising it, and how the information can be used can be really helpful. And I think with the main advice I'd give with framing is to make it clear. It may be clear to you, but it may not be clear in how you convey it, of what your motive is, and that you're, that this isn't just how you see the implications of raising or not raising this issue. And then the third thing is tone, in terms of, and to me, that's just basic communication skills, and something that, some of us are better at than others. And oftentimes people earlier in their career, they're still trying to, they're still learning this about, how aggressively to communicate, how forcefully, sort of understanding the communication norms within the work environment. You can raise something that is very challenging, that is basically saying, I think you're wrong, but you can say it in a way that is more or less respectful and more or less polite, more or less, humble, and recognizing, I could be wrong, but I think you're, this is the thing. So, so the timing, the framing, the tone, all of those, I think, make a big difference.
Excellent. So is there ever such a thing as too much voice in an organization?
It's remarkable how often I've gotten that question, So, I've been interested in, so my belief is that in most organizations, the problem is not enough voice and too much silence. So, that's the problem that I see as bigger. But yeah, I do think that you could have too much voice, because, and I think we probably can all think of situations that we've been in where we're all just challenging and talking and questioning and doubting and just, okay, we need to make a decision, we need to act. And I think that needs to be managed. I don't think that's a pressing problem in most organizations, but I would tell any leader to be aware of, you want to create an open environment, but you also need to make it clear to people that there's time for debate, and there's time for questioning, and there's time for new ideas, and then there's time for, okay, let's just all get with the program and execute.
Right, exactly. Very good. I'm curious, because you hear things when you talk to managers today about millennials being different. Do you find that they are that there's less silence with millennials, or have you really seen any differences between them and their more senior colleagues? Any thoughts there?
Well, so I haven't explicitly looked at this. So I haven't, done a study where I've, directly compared millennials to older workers. But what I can tell you is that the early work that I did on silence that really struck me, and just how pervasive this was, it was with millennials. And I was struck, and again, these were, educated, successful, people early in their careers. and yet their experience of feeling that it was not safe for them to speak up, and I was struck by how easily they could think of recent instances where they had not raised issues. And it's really struggled with that, and it felt conflicted with that. And so my intuition is that this is as true, perhaps, or no less true for millennials than for people, other cohorts. Now, where there may be a difference is, and this may partly reflect just some of the stereotypes about millennials, but I think there's probably some truth as well, is that millennials, we know that there's very different norms about communication, and in terms of, informality of communication and modes of communication among younger workers, and so I think that when they do voice, they may do so in a way that's different from from some of the more senior colleagues.
So they may be more likely to send a text or an email versus face-to-face conversation. Is that?
Yeah, I think that would be something I would hypothesize. More likely to, perhaps, and this would worry me if it's true, although it would probably depend on the generation of the person on the receiving end. So if it's millennial to millennial versus, millennial to Generation X or something. But communicating in a more informal style versus more formal. And so I don't just mean that, email or text versus face-to-face, but even just in kind of the, the language you use and the formality of the communication.
Gotcha. Very cool. Well, I just have a couple more questions for you. Is there anything a question you wish I'd asked that I haven't asked that might be interesting for those listening to know about?
A question you didn't ask. You asked a lot of things. You covered a lot of ground. Well, I mean, I can maybe just where I don't have, I should be careful of what I say because I may not have a good answer to this, but I am, I've been doing research on voice and silence for a number of years now and keep finding new things to study. So, kind of where I'm going next with it is a bit of an open question, but some of the things that I'm becoming particularly interested in, and I'm working on a project right now, is looking at how, really trying to understand the effects for individuals of speaking up. And one study that I'm hoping to get published soon and working on is really interesting, because if you look at what's been written on voice and what I've written on voice, there's such an emphasis on the image risks that if you speak up, you may look like a troublemaker, a complainer. It may harm you, and people express that as well. If you talk to employees, oftentimes what they say is, "Well, I didn't want to raise this because it would make me look bad," and yet we've now done 3 different studies, and we found consistently across those studies that actually speaking up is more likely to make you other people to see you more positively rather than more negatively. Now, I think that depends a lot on how you speak up, and so that's where I'd really like to go next, kind of building on what we were just talking about, of kind of the framing issues and so forth.
Fascinating. Because one of the things I was struck by too in reading some of the things you'd written was, of course, from a manager perspective, I always think about the good the organization can get if employees are willing to speak up, but also the impact on somebody when they do speak up and they are listened to and they see that their opinions are valued, and what that does for the individual as well. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, and that's something that I don't think we pay as much attention to. So there's a lot of focus on, a voice is really good for the organization. It helps with better decision making and correcting problems and innovation. But for, part of where I first came to this field was really interested in employee well-being. And, we've all been experienced, it doesn't feel good. We feel really conflicted when we feel like we have something to say and we're not saying it, or we're aware of a problem we're not raising. That's the sort of thing that keeps people awake at night. When you haven't said something, and where you see it really striking, and some of my work is also begun to look at situations where people are aware of misconduct, unethical behavior. And we know that, there's been a number of studies, and the best estimates are that only about half of employees who witness wrongdoing call attention to that, bring it to someone's attention. And so that's a situation where I think people it feels particularly risky to raise these issues. And yet, in terms of the emotional toll of knowing that something bad is going on and not raising it, either because you feel nobody, they don't want to hear it, nobody's going to do anything, or that, you may get slapped down for raising it. The really salient examples we've seen of whistleblowers and what happens to them, internal whistleblowers, even before people go externally, when people raise things, sometimes management doesn't want to hear it, and it can be risky. And so those are, and the toll on employees, I think, is non-trivial.
Well, and there's so many examples that when they do go public, it has such a devastating effect on everything. So,
yeah.
All right. So my last question for you is, has there been one or two pleasant surprises in this journey that you've been down on? And you started talking about how wanting to help make workplaces better. Has there been one or two pleasant surprises along the way that you would share?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, probably a lot. I think to me, the pleasant surprise has been that, so I mentioned that this research, this kind of stream of research, is something that really resonates with people. And what I've really been pleasantly pleased is that when I give talks about this, just being able to validate people's own experience, and that feels that that's an empowering thing. So, okay, it's not just me, that this is something, and here's some tools, and here's some things of how we can maybe create workplaces where, but both to help people themselves feel more comfortable speaking up, but also for managers to enable their employees to speak up. So that's been very rewarding to see that impact. And it's also been just, I don't know if it's a pleasant surprise, but it's been, again, rewarding. It's just, this has become an area where a lot of people are doing just really important, really interesting research. So I feel really optimistic that we're going to just continue to better understand issues around voice.
Your mouth to God's ear, absolutely. Well, thank you, Dr. Morrison, so much for coming on the podcast and being willing to share your insights here. And I hope the listeners are soaking it all in and improving their leadership as a result.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
This podcast was brought to you by Bigger Brains, online training that won't bore you to tears. Expand the minds of your workforce at getbiggerbrains.com. Thanks for tuning in to Permission to Speak. If you want to increase collaboration and innovation in your organization, check out more resources available at speakingpractically.com or give me a call, Kelly Vandever, at 770-597-1108.